Could we get, just by show of hands, how many people here are from Guelph or Kitchener-Waterloo, the region? In other words, not the Torontonians. Awesome.
Oh, we're not in Toronto anymore, Toto.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's great to be here. This crowd is awesome. So hopefully you like our presentation. Again, we've kind of talked, and probably most of you have already talked with your clients about, how to maybe, have a bit more of cost upfront to lower your energy costs down the future. So we kind of want to maybe challenge that and ask you also to introduce carbon in that equation. So how can we, lower it and just use it as a currency early on in the design process? So yeah, and thank you, Daniel. I also heard today on CBC that it was the Women's Day. So it's great that we are both just finishing this presentation. So it's great.
All right, so for the presentation, we're going to quickly walk you through how we in the firm started measuring carbon in our buildings and what tools we use. Then we'll walk you through some case studies so you can see what our results looked like. And then lastly, we'll look at those results and we'll set some budgets and we'll see what we can do going forward. When we look at carbon emissions, we usually look at two different things. So we have the material carbon emission on one side, which comes from anything throughout the construction process, the manufacturing of the materials and transportation. That is usually a one-time cost. So it'll be a number that is generated at the beginning of the construction process, but then does accumulate over time. And then the operational carbon emissions is our energy usage. So that's something that will add on every single year and it'll keep getting bigger. So when we add those two things together, we get something called the CUI, which is carbon use intensity. Because we have operational carbon kind of adding on every single year, we need to look at it over a period of time, which is what you see that little X there for, meaning we have to define that range. And this nice graphic is provided by Builders for Climate Action, and they have been using CUI 30 in most of their reports. And that also very much aligns with our 2050 goals. So we decided for the purpose of this presentation to go with a CUI 30. So we're looking at every building in this presentation over a span of 30 years. Now, how do we actually count the carbon? For embodied carbon, we're looking at a tool called BEAM, which is by Builders for Climate Action. It's in a Google spreadsheet, super simple to use, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. And then for our operational carbon, our passive house whiz Anna will tell you about that.
Yeah, so most of you probably are already kind of familiar with PHPP, which stands for Passive House Planning Package. And over there, we just have that kind of the graph comparison of heating and cooling, losses and gains in the building. So those are our two main softwares that we would use for the carbon and energy, but how we do make this basically to compare, so we can not talk apples to oranges basically. So in terms of embodied carbon, again in the industry, it's how it's measured, it's kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And operational carbon, it's just the energy that we use. And again, it's kilowatts hour per square meter per year. And the numbers that you see down there, those relate to the conversion factors that are established by the Government of Canada, which 28 is to convert kilowatts hours per square meter to embodied carbon equivalent, kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And then when we look at gas, really the number that, the number that we see down there, 1921, that relates to the 177, that it's fairly across Canada, so that's a number that we would use to convert the cubic meters of gas used. So again, like in Ontario's 921, in other provinces, that goes all the way up to 1966, so fairly similar. However, the 28 that we see there for electricity, that is only for Ontario. So we can see that for other provinces and territories in Canada, that comparison between how the gas and embodied carbon, the embodied carbon in gas versus electricity will greatly, differ. Because like in some provinces, that 28, instead of multiplying by 28, you're multiplying by 160. So that's a different conversation. So today, everything will be just for Ontario. So we're gonna be looking at 2 case studies. First one is a backyard home that we're designing in Kitchener. And we kind of like the baseline is already fairly good. So we are using triple glazed windows, low siding, like wood siding, but like we were looking at, what type of foundation should we choose and what type of like buildings assemblies should we choose, just so we are lowering basically as much as possible the embodied carbon and for this backyard home. So those are really the questions that we'll try to answer today. Just not to throw a lot of numbers right now because we're gonna see these numbers in a graph, but like just so you can compare for the passive house performance option, we had the operational carbon and embodied carbon. Operational carbon, as you can see, for the both kind of like foundation options that we were looking at, either slab on grade or a crawl space, is fairly similar, as you can see. But as we move to embodied carbon, the slab on grade was roughly 2/3 of the crawl space option, and that is just mainly due to more concrete used and additional installation for that 4 feet crawl space for that option. So just kind of like show of hands, just because we love show of hands, how many people think that the light green line, that would be the passive house performance house? Just Daniel? Good. And how many people think that the kind of like teal lines relate to the green lines relate to the better than code option? No one wants to. This is not a test. So the 2 bottom ones are both the slab on grade, and the 2 top ones are crawl space. And the lighter option is the better than code. So as we can see here, these 2, as we were seeing before, the slab on grade has a lower embodied carbon. So again, less energy right up front. And that's what Kim was saying, that is a one time. So that's kind of like what we counted there. And then the slab on grade, which has kind of like the more gentle steep, again, that just means that will require less energy for the use of the life of the building, basically. So, right at the CUI 30 that Kim was mentioning for the carbon in the building, like we have at some point to compare and to have this comparison point. So at the CUI 30, we pretty much cross these 2 lines over there. So basically that means that right after the 30-year mark, the passive houses slab on grade will perform better than the better than code slab on grade option. And then this 6,000, that is just the delta basically between the crawl space options and the slab on grade options, and it just happens to both cross roughly around that CUI 30. So is that good? Is that bad? Is that so-so? Later on in the presentation, we're going to see how that number relates to some benchmarking that Builders for Climate Action have put up there. So we'll see in more detail, that number, how that relates. And I think I'll pass it on to Kim.
Thank you, Anna. All right, so we'll look at our second case study here. In this instance, it's a retrofit. So we're now looking at a double white brick semi-detached in Toronto. It's around 200 square meters. And the goal for this exercise was to decarbonize the building. The client had already made the decision to put in an air source heat pump and replace the windows. We're still going to look at the impact of that, but the real important question for this one was, do we want to overclad the building as well to save extra energy or not? So let's look at the numbers. So we divided it into 3 different phases, the first one being the existing. So we have the existing building with the gas furnace, and we can see we're currently using 4,500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. We also put that down here in heating demand, because that's probably a number that most of you understand a little better. So we have 85 kilowatt per hour per square meter a year. So that's quite high. Our passive house goal for RETROFIT would be 30. And we also have the price down here per year, which is 21,000 a year. And all of these numbers are based on actual usage. So the client provided us with their bills, and that's how we extracted this. When we look at embodied carbon, we have a big 0 there because we're just looking at the existing building. We're not adding any materials on at this point. The next phase then, we're adding the air source heat pump, and we're adding some new windows. So we're looking at 332. So that is 7% down from the previous number. Sorry, that's around 7% of the previous number. So an insane dip. And we're getting down to 47 kilowatt per hour per square meter a year. So closer to that passive house target, but still not there. And we lowered the bills around $200 a year. However, that also comes with the 3.2 thousand embodied carbon. And lastly, we'll look at our overcladding, so the real question. So we got the operational carbon down to 197, and we finally hit our passive house RETROFIT goal of 30, so we got it to 28, and we got our bills down around $800 from the existing model. That, however, comes with 8,000 kilograms of carbon as a one-time payment for embodied. So now, with all of those numbers, we're going to try the show of hands again. So, to overclad or not to overclad. So if we're looking at a CUI 30, I'd like everyone to raise their hand right now. And I'm going to start slowly counting upwards the years. If you think the payback is before the 30 years or after, at any point, just lower your hand. So when the year hits, where you think the payback period starts, just lower your hand. Does everyone raise your hand? All right. So who thinks the payback period is at 10 years? Who thinks it's at 20 years? Who thinks it's at 30 years? Okay. Who thinks it's at 40 years? 50? 60. All right, so we got some pretty enthusiastic people in the crowd. Great. So we'll get to the results in a second. So let's look at the graph. It's kind of hard to tell from here what the results are. But what I do want to point out is this line right here. So that's the existing. And we can't even see where it ends up at CUI 30. It's not even on the graph. And then we have our 2 phases going here. Our payback period is at 35 years. So the majority of you were somewhere in the right ballpark. We can clearly see our CUI 30 here. And yes, at CUI 30, it is telling us not to overclad technically because we would be saving 743 if we don't overclad. So to answer the question, it's kind of similar to what Anna was saying. We can't really answer it. It's a maybe. I don't know if it's better. We don't know if it's better. It really depends on the goal of the client. Are they experiencing thermal discomfort? Is there any concerns about soundproofing or mold buildup in the walls? Or do they just want to exchange the cladding anyways? Did they want an aesthetic difference? So it is really important to look at these cases on a case-by-case basis. But the real importance, I think, that we can take away from this one is that just adding an air source heat pump is really doing most of the heavy lifting just to get away from this big red line here. All right, and that brings us into budget setting. So when we talk about budgets, we already have 2 budgets kind of established in our minds when we design buildings, I think. Most of us do, however. So we have the financial budget, which usually comes from the client. That's obviously also an important factor in deciding if something like overcladding is feasible or not. Then we have our energy budget, which usually comes from an entity like Passive House or other guidelines. And now it is on us to introduce a carbon budget, mostly embodied carbon, because again, Passive House is already kind of giving us this operational carbon budget. So that's on us to establish, to measure our buildings, to assess them, and to improve them. And Builders for Climate Action, we're going to reference their super cool slides again, has done part of the work. So they've looked at embodied carbon and how to budget for that. So if we look at how we can implement it in our firm or how you can implement it in your firm, we're looking at immediate goals and future goals. And we think that for immediate goals, it's really important to gain a sense of awareness, to start diving into these case studies and to record your findings. And then for future goals, introduce hard goals, actually set numbers and try to achieve those hard set numbers by calculating your CUI. So let's see where our buildings are ranking on here. So our case study A, the new build that Anna was presenting you with, is somewhere between the moderate carbon range, which is a 2 to 3 year goal, so that's great if we can actually build it that way. And our retrofit is actually in the 0 carbon range. Again, this is for embodied carbon only. So what this really shows us is that if we can make the existing work, that will get us a way better result than if we tear it down and build something new. It is way easier to achieve our 0 carbon mission with that because we already have the existing, which we don't have to account for. It's already there. And now Anna will wrap it up and show you what the buildings came out to be in comparison.
Thank you, Kim. So, so we thought that it was really necessary to see these two studies and how do they compare. Especially around, what kind of like Kim was saying, anything existing, just switching, making the switch, that's a big, jump into lowering really your carbon. And again, going back to those numbers that we were presenting early on, that is, these numbers are only for Ontario. So will be completely different for another territory and province. But then, so that's kind of like what we are performing. For the case study A, we would kind of like, our preferred option would be the Passive House level grade, which we knew that, around the 30-year payback, CUI, it's slightly over, but then operational carbon will be much lower for all the years after those first 30 years. And then for the overcladding option, as you can see, really the embodied carbon aspect in these two, just because they are fairly similar, again, phase 2 would perform better after those 30 years. So, no-brainer, I think, which way to go. And again, I think right now here, the kind of longer presentation probably that we should continue is to how all of these come together also with cost, because we kind of acknowledge that and it's a big part of, we have to make this, that it makes sense financially so we can, keep on doing the good work that, everyone in this room is already doing. So we actually wanted Builders for Climate Action to present today. They couldn't make it, so that's kind of what we are doing this presentation. But for those of you who are not familiar, we they have BEAM. It's fairly easy to use, kind of set up in the same way as PHP. So if you have already some knowledge with PHP, it will feel somewhat similar and familiar. So we encourage everyone, if you have a design team and you're looking at this, to kind of introduce within your workflows and processes how to account for carbon in all your projects. So basically what you're designing and how it does relate to embodied carbon in the industry. So we encourage everyone to go to their website. The BEAM is free. They take donations, so I would also strongly suggest that if you download it, please donate to the team. They provide support, and they use those funds to keep advancing the tool. So really important that we support them as much as we can. And and that's our last slide. Oh, 30 seconds. Thank you, Daniel. So yeah, thank you very much. We're here to, if anyone has any questions, we're here around today. And we hope you like your presentation and that we kind of like incited you to maybe some change in the future.